This is the SF Productions Podcast Network.
The Man of Steel hits the big screen again.
From the Pop Culture Bunker, I'm Mindy.
And I'm Mark. You can check out our audio podcast, How I Got My Wife to Read Comics, on iTunes or on our website, sfpodcastnetwork.com. Now, as we record this, the new Man of Steel film is about to hit the theaters.
Next weekend!
That's right.
Woo! Mark will be there right away.
Exactly.
That's one he does go to see.
Exactly. So, let's discuss the history of Superman in the movies.
Okay.
And it only took 3 years from his first comic book appearance in Action Comics #1, 1938. By 1941, he moved to the movie screens. He already had a radio series, which is really amazing for a pop culture concept that long ago to move that quickly through media.
Do you think some of it might have been because comics were more popular then?
Oh, absolutely.
Or more ubiquitous?
Well,
they were a larger percentage of what people read than they are today.
There wasn't nearly as many things to compete against as
Yes.
there is today. So, as I mentioned, there was a radio series and then the first movies. And the first movies were cartoons from the Fleischer Brothers in 1941 to 1943. And this is really what solidified the look of the characters. It is a very Art Deco / World War II poster type look. Mm-hmm. It's also the first time that he actually flew rather than jumped, because in the comic book he was still just leaping 1/8 of a mile.
Ah.
And they tried to do that in animation and it really looked kind of silly.
Well, yeah.
So, he's just flying now. So it was the Fleischer cartoons that made Superman fly. They used the radio voices, so the voices from the radio series, Bud Collyer and Joan Alexander. And you can either find the radio dramas out on the internet, or if you watch the 1960s Superman Saturday morning cartoon, it was the same voices.
Okay.
They used the same voices even then. And there were 17 short subjects. It was hugely expensive for the time. The series cost, in 2012 dollars, $7.8 million, which is a lot of money to throw at something you were trying to get kids to run into the theater and spend 10 cents on.
But that would have been more like just one feature,
right,
of like a 2 or 3 feature day at the movies.
Exactly.
Right?
Oh yeah, it was like 5-10 minute short subject, and maybe there'd be another cartoon and then
a newsreel,
and then a double feature and all that. And you can see a very similar look to the Fleischer cartoons in the Warner Brothers cartoons in the 1990s.
And you can still find these, can't you?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they're in the public domain. So you can find bootleg versions, not even bootleg, they're official versions all over the place. Then there were the Columbia serials, and these went from 1947 to 1950. Kirk Alyn played the Man of Tomorrow. In fact, in publicity, they said he just played Clark Kent. And they said, well, Superman plays Superman.
Yeah.
I was able to meet Kirk Alyn and shake his hand in 1988. There was a Superman convention in Cleveland that year. And they had him there. And so he was very old at that point. He only passed away a couple years later. And I remember distinctly, just kind of hanging around in the hallway, and he had just gone through this big event where, hundreds of people are in this room, but then he's walking around later and people aren't even recognizing him. So I went over and shook his hand.
Oh, are you sure it was him?
I'm sure it was him. Noel Neill played Lois, who of course played Lois later in the 1950s TV series.
And we met Noel Neill too, didn't we?
Right.
Yes.
Right. Exactly. We met her at the Superman celebration
in Metropolis,
Illinois, which, as we tape this, is happening this weekend.
Oh, it was kind of fun.
It was kind of fun. It's kind of like if you go to a local town and they have a pumpkin festival. Think Superman instead of pumpkins, but it's
yes. You don't eat Superman,
right? Yeah, yeah. So in these serials, is very cheaply made. Superman flew by running behind an object, and then an animated version of Superman would go into the sky.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. Uh-huh.
So you always had to have a boulder or a car or something you could run behind and then fly off. The suit was gray and brown and not red and blue because it looked better in black and white. It looked more like the right colors.
Mm-hmm.
There were 2 serials. The first one, the villain was the Spider Lady, and the second serial was Atom Man, who was actually Lex Luthor.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was then Superman and the Mole Men, 1951, which was a test film for the projected TV series.
So, did it ever actually go to the theaters?
It was actually in the theaters, and they were kind of gauging, would this work?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the George Reeves Superman. Phyllis Coates played Lois, who was the first Lois on the TV series before Noel Neill took it over. And so it was only like I said, it was only 58 minutes. It was very short for a movie, but it was thrown in a double feature, that type of thing.
I think now if you see it on TV or something, like if they're playing the old Superman series, they show it in 2 half hours or something like that.
Right. Very much like a backdoor pilot would be done today. All right, so then of course there was the Superman TV series and the terrible thing that happened to George Reeves, and so people didn't want to touch that character for a while because of the negative connotations.
Well, and he really was the first one that got sort of stereotyped into his role. He got too associated with the Superman role.
That he couldn't get any other
jobs.
work.
Yeah.
So you have to go all the way to 1978 and Superman the movie. Now, I remember being dropped off at Millette Mall in Canton to be first in line. Like, my dad dropped me off on his way to work, and I stood there for like 4 hours for the 12 o'clock showing. Yes, I wanted to see this. Yeah. I was a geek, and still am. Alexander and Ilea Salkind were the producers. Richard Donner directed. He actually began shooting 1 and Superman 2 at the same time, very much like they did with the Lord of the Rings movies or the Harry Potter movies.
Well, in the Harry Potter movies, they didn't do more than
they
one
did?
at a time.
Oh, okay. Well, so we'll find out more about what happened with 2 in a minute. There were multiple writers and directors during development, and it was actually a long-term development. It finally ended up, Mario Puzo ended up being one of the writers. But, of course, best known for Christopher Reeve, who was a soap opera actor at the time, and he'd had some Broadway experience, but virtually no one knew who he was. He had to bulk up for the role. He went from 170 to 212 pounds. He was only paid $250,000.
Well, in 1978, that still was...
Well, when you consider what happens next. Margot Kidder as Lois, who I really never bought her in the role as Lois. She was okay, but I just thought she was a little too brash for the character. Marlon Brando was Jor-El, and this is when I talk about the money. For 12 days of work, he was paid $3.7 million plus 11.75% of the profits.
And that is just ridiculous for what his role was.
Which may be 10 minutes of actual screen time, if that.
There was all kinds of stories about that, too, wasn't there? About how he wanted to play Jor-El as a giant potato or something?
Right, and he wanted to be like this green briefcase on screen. It's very strange. Now, before Christopher Reeve got the role, just about everybody who was big in Hollywood in the mid-'70s was offered the role of Superman. Here's a partial list. Robert Redford, and so, obviously, when you think Superman, you think blonde hair. Burt Reynolds, Sylvester Stallone, James Caan, Lyle Wagner, who ended up on the Wonder Woman TV series.
Steve.
Christopher Walken, Nick Nolte, Chris Christopherson, and Charles Bronson were all at various points offered the role of Superman.
See, I really think they needed to go with the unknown. And I still feel kind of that way that, whoever they cast as one of these iconic characters, because we were talking about it with Doctor Who also, is you really want somebody who can inhabit this iconic role,
right?
And who you don't imagine, well, he does this much better than he did that, or, picturing that person in another role.
You have
to. A lot of baggage.
You have to basically see him in the role of the character, and that's it. And you don't want, as you said, any baggage. There's a number of comedy lines and comedy bits, especially for the villain, and of course, Gene Hackman played Luthor, and I really enjoyed his portrayal of the character. And just as a reminder, this is the spinning the world backwards to save Lois movie. So if you're trying to remember which one was that, that's what that movie was. Well, looks like we're running out of time. It's going much longer than we expected. So we're going to cut this now, and we'll put the rest of the movies in our next episode.
Okay. You can check out our audio podcast, How I Got My Wife to Read Comics, on iTunes or on our website, sfpodcastnetwork.com. From the Pop Culture Bunker, I'm Mindy.
And I'm Mark. Thanks for watching.
Bye.